Okay, so we've cooled the room right down and we've deprived you of food because that's the way we thought it would get lively. So it's like putting rats into a container and eventually... Anyhow, so my name's Charles Watkinson. I'm AUL for Publishing at University of Michigan and Director of University of Michigan Press. And today we have a session called Journey to the Center of a Digital Project. What we're going to do is I'm going to start with a little bit of a kind of a definition of what we're talking about when we talk about digital project. Then we're going to basically talk about a couple of projects. One, a model contract for digital scholarship, and Lisa Macklin from Emory University will talk about that. And the second one, a costing tool for use with open access and also increasingly with digital projects. And Nancy Maron, consultant, and Kim Schmelzinger, consultant, will talk about that project. And at certain points, we will stop and we will say, what are we forgetting? And at those points, I will roam around and I will pick on you. So the sort of question here is, what is a digital project and why should we care? So in this context, we're interested in something which is a kind of a theme running through this conference. It's interesting to see so many conversations come up about this topic, and that is publications that cannot be fully reproduced in print, but are created with an intention to commit them to the scholarly record. So they have preservation and discoverability in mind. So something that we're doing there is we're making a little bit of a differentiation between a kind of a sandbox type activity, a sort of digital humanities sandbox activity, and the creation of something that looks a lot more like a publication. And there is a plan to preserve, make it discoverable, make it sustainable. So just to say, we think this is an important topic because more and more of these sorts of things are coming along the pike. And here are just three examples from university presses. And university presses are clearly only one of the players in this landscape, but they are a significant one. And these are just various projects from the last few months. So Stanford University Press, UCL Press in London, and this is University of Colorado Press. And some of these projects are sponsored by Maron, some of them are not, but they're happening. So why does this all matter to us? So, and us, by us I mean everybody in the Charleston landscape. So this is a meeting of publishers, but it's a meeting of librarians, and it's also, very importantly, a meeting of vendors, and those are people who connect publishers and libraries. So the reason this all matters to us is it's our job, ultimately, all of us, to support our scholars in making their works durable and discoverable. And we're all helping to help them make a transition to a truly digital landscape. And all our scholars, all our authors are digital scholars at this point. But we need to create an ecosystem which makes that a safe thing to be. And here we are particularly talking about humanities and qualitative social science scholars. We know this is also true in the sciences. And so the purpose of this lively lunch is to discuss what new tools we need to create as publishers, vendors, and librarians to sustain these new form publications. So one of the things is, I think it's easy to get into the abstract and to get into the theoretical. What we're about is very much about the practical. And so this is an example of the sort of publication we're thinking about, just to ground the conversation. You'll have seen perhaps a presentation on Fulcrum as the loser in the fast pitch competition. Not that I'm bitter in any way at all, but this is the platform that we're developing led by University of Michigan, involving Minnesota, Penn State, Indiana, and Northwestern. And this is the first, this is one of 5 case studies. This is the first case study publication that will be impossible to reproduce in print, that cannot have a print component. It's an archaeological site report, and it allows a user to approach this ancient house that's being excavated near Rome through 3 different lenses. So firstly, a conventional textual narrative, but a very interlinked one. Secondly, a database of finds and contexts. And thirdly, a 3D visualization of the house that was dug. And this is built on a software gaming engine called Unity 3D. So the 3 are very, very integrally connected, and this is really something that cannot be properly reproduced in print. So this is what I would like you to sort of keep in mind a little bit, this kind of publication, as we think about the tools. And that's just our advertised fulcrum. So here are just a few of my ideas, and I think what we found as a group is we haven't really come to a sort of a conception together, a sort of a taxonomy of these different things that might change when digital projects become the norm. So these are just some ideas that we're throwing out there. How do digital projects challenge us? Well, one of the things we notice is there's a strong emphasis on collaboration among the creators of these works. You know, there's issues around contributorship become quite big. You'll always have like some software people in the mix. You'll have a variety of authors from different institutions. You'll probably increasingly have sort of graduate students, people like that involved. And so there are issues around contributorship. There are also clearly, and this comes up again and again, issues around credit in promotion and tenure, things like that, how to really give credit. And there are also a number of issues in this area of third-party permissions and being able to clear rights to use multimedia, for example, and other more complex third-party materials. Just some of those issues in that sort of bucket. Financial planning, we don't have a lot of reference points for the development or maintenance costs of these kinds of projects. You know, university presses have tended to have developed quite good systems based on comparing to the costs of creating something similar. We don't really have those reference points. And then there's this hidden cost, the cost of maintaining the work over the longer term. So some new concepts in there. Discovery and acquisition. How does anyone find these projects? I mean, that's a famous problem for almost every digital humanities project, and there will always be somebody in the audience of a digital humanities project trying to find the thing through the library catalog and absolutely failing. The discoverability of these projects is atrocious. And how do what role do libraries play in acquiring these products? And one very important distinction I want to make is open access and digital scholarship are 2 separate things. There's no reason why a digital scholarship object should be open access. And we see at this conference amazing digital scholarship work from Alexander Street Press, for example. That is not generally open access materials. But it is true, and we agree, that open access truly allows a digital scholarship object to be its best, to really play in the networked environment, especially if that is also accompanied by Creative Commons, by open licensing. Preservation, these can't be easily hosted locally in a library collection, and who bears that responsibility? And then versioning, this is something that our colleagues at University of Minnesota Press are working on interestingly with iterations and versions with their Manifold project. But we constantly see authors starting to approach us saying, I'd like to update my book, my project, my long-form digital project. Now, that challenges our workflows after the thing's published. We think we've done with that, and now we want to move on. It also really challenges citation practices. So a number of issues. I want to move on straight away now to the model publishing contract for long-form digital scholarship, because this is one of the sorts of tools that we feel could actually help work through some of these issues. So let me just pass over to Lisa Macklin.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us during your lunchtime. So the model publishing contract for long-form scholarship actually grew out of previous projects that were funded by the Mellon Foundation. Okay. Hold on a second. Nothing more amusing than... There you go. Nothing more amusing than a Mac user trying to use a PC. Okay, so the model publishing contract basically grew out of discussions around two previously funded Mellon projects, one at Emory University, one that was University of Michigan, and then also Indiana University. And essentially, Emory University is a university without a press. We've never had a press. In the great scheme of things, we could be considered a free rider in the system of university presses, and we do acknowledge that to some extent because we expect our humanities faculty to publish books, certainly as part of tenure and promotion. And so the idea of kind of having a new publishing contract actually grew out of a conversation that Charles and I had at lunch. So hopefully we'll also have other good ideas emerge out of having a lunch. Breaking bread together can bring good things. But we really wanted to provide a tool as we're kind of in this transition of really supporting digital long-form scholarship in humanities and trying to answer some of these questions that Charles has raised. There's also opportunities for doing things in new and different ways, and one of the things that grew out of the studies that we had done at each of our institutions was really looking at recommendations around institutional subventions and then also open access distribution. So at Emory, when we got this Mellon grant for a planning grant, we produced a report called The Future of the Monograph, and that work was really done by 13 faculty members, myself, and then the co-director of our Emory Center for Digital Scholarship. And it was really a sustained conversation over a period of time. And what was interesting was that the faculty members did, to a person, really see the benefit of open access distribution. But as Charles mentioned, when you start talking about a model publishing contract, we're really trying to do something that accommodates whether something is open access with Creative Commons license, whether there is a subvention, et cetera. So the process to get to this point was really having a meeting. We had really a lot of good input from University of Minnesota Press, University of Michigan. Nancy was there as well. We had University of Georgia Press. There were some attorneys in the room, some librarians, and we really kind of went through what we really wanted to see in a model publishing contract. So we are at the moment, we're actually kind of between 5 and 6. We are waiting for the attorney that we have hired to create the final draft, and then it will be made publicly available. And we're going to be seeking input really from the community at large. And so the community here really is the scholarly communications community, university presses, librarians, attorneys, faculty who are authors, et cetera. So just to be clear, this is not something that is looking to replace the traditional book contract. Also in the work that we did, we very much recognize that the traditional book has value. We are not talking about the traditional book going away. We're talking about accommodating these new long-form digital scholarship. And so what we were really looking for is the ability to address some of the questions that Charles raised around open access distribution, whether you choose to do that or not, institution or other funder subvention for these works, and the fact that likely, unlike a book where you have an author who may deliver a text of 110,000 words, most of these digital projects are really often by a team and contributing in a lot of different ways. And so we really wanted to be able to accommodate that as well. So our goals really were to have this as a kind of fundamental building block, a place where people could start because there aren't really existing contracts that address some of these issues particularly well. We also really wanted to be balanced between the author and the press, and I think to everyone's credit, really, although we had only 1 or 2 folks in the room who were with the author hat on. The author was very much there and represented, and really there was, I think, a good balance that was reached. Also, we wanted this model publishing contract to be easier for authors to read and understand. I work with faculty at Emory on their book contracts, and I have the advantage of having a law degree and a library degree, and a lot of what I do is simply explain to them what this contract is obligating them to do. So we really wanted to do with less legalese. It's just easier for everyone. You know, it reduces that friction between the author and the press when everyone's just simply trying to understand the words on the page. And we also wanted it to be shorter and more flexible. So the construct that we came up with is a core contract that addresses the things you would expect to see in these kinds of contracts, you know, copyright retained by the author, the press's obligations, et cetera. And then a series of schedules. And it's really in the schedules that we were able to basically really have some flexibility. And so in the schedules, the first one really is defining the work. And not only there is it saying, you know, author will deliver a text of 110,000 words, it's really more what are the technical requirements? Who's responsible for hosting? Who's responsible for preservation and revising? We're not dictating what those terms should be, but more having a place where those terms can be defined so they're understood and the expectations are understood by both the press and by the author. And we think that there's a likelihood that perhaps it's going to be the library of the author's institution who may be responsible for doing some of that preservation work. For the next schedule, we focused on what the author can do with content in the work. The traditional model is the author turns over copyright, and we really were looking at something that was a little more flexible. If there is a Creative Commons license, and that's an if, authors' reuse would not be more restrictive than what the Creative Commons license allowed. But we also wanted to be mindful that it's very possible, as Charles mentioned, that there may be one of these digital long-form scholarship works that would be sold, so it would not be appropriate for a Creative Commons license. And in that case, really what the author is looking for is royalties. And so we do have consideration for those commercial uses, not only for the initial release of the work, but sub-licenses that may happen at a later time. So how we credit not only the author, but all of these other folks who may work on these projects. We used Project Credit as an example. It's hosted by ORCID. If you're not familiar with it, it's worth checking out. So we wanted to have a place for that. We also wanted to have a place where if there are other stakeholders, whether it's an institutional subvention or subvention from another group, that there would be not only a place to define what that support would be, so that the press would have confidence, but also whether or not that funder had some requirements that the press needed to be aware of. And really this is where the idea of subventions and the work that Nancy and Kim have done is really essential, because if you're asking someone to provide a subvention to support long-form scholarship, understanding what those costs are and how those costs were arrived at becomes really vital in that process. So the other is, as Charles also mentioned, content that isn't original to the author. And so we're also going to be providing some example permissions letters, because this is really an area where there's not necessarily comfort among the communities where you have rights holders in providing multimedia, images, et cetera, that may be published open access or in other ways. And so we recognize that this is a challenge. We can't necessarily overcome that challenge, but we can provide some tools. The publication schedule, so the author knows what they have to deliver when, and that might not be a single date, it might likely be a series of dates. And then the publisher really defining what roles they're going to have as well. For marketing efforts, we really viewed this as a joint effort between the author and the publisher. Particularly for these digital works, there are so many opportunities to promote them in ways that go beyond what we kind of think of as the traditional marketing efforts, and the author really does have a role to play. Revenue sharing and royalties, if that's appropriate. The advantage of this kind of schedule approach is if there isn't any chance for royalties, if that's simply not a part of this particular publication, then that particular schedule can also be left off. And then disclosure of information required by Section 4. I realize you don't have Section 4, but that's really getting to the idea that if there was some interest in a company or organization connected to the work, that be disclosed. This is much more common in the sciences, but it was something the attorney recommended and that we felt really was worthwhile. So having that kind of broad overview, what do you think we didn't really consider? In other words, what are some of the other things that really do change in digital scholarship?
I will pick on somebody. Is there anything else that changes? I'm going to start with Susan, who was actually at this meeting and has done digital scholarship stuff.
Sure. So one of the things I don't see in the bullets that you listed, and we did discuss it a little bit in our meeting, is when these digital projects are meant to evolve over a long period of time, when they are iterative and perhaps they'll be published over 18 months or 2 years or even 5 years, how do the schedules work when you've got deadlines that might not be imagined in the beginning because you know that they're still actively producing the scholarship that would then lead to publication?
I think you could do that in one of two ways. One is that you could go really within the work and define there that it was iterative, and then you could use the schedule on the for Schedule F publication schedule, and then also kind of outline there, what would be expected of the author on a date and when that would be published by the press. The other advantage of kind of the schedule approach is that unlike the current book contracts we often use, you could do the schedules at a later date. So that you could have the contract in place, and we've talked about this about marketing. You may not know exactly what the marketing efforts are going to be at the time of the conceptualization of the long form scholarship and what it will be. So you have some flexibility there, and being able to kind of come up with that schedule after the initial signing of the contract. And in that case, often what is a good practice is that you sign the bottom of the page, and you date it so that you're recognizing that this came at a later date, but both parties are in agreement.
Can I ask one other thing? And another aspect of that is versioning, which is really hard because if authors want to continually update their work or change it, how do you set the limits as a publisher to say we can reasonably accommodate this much with regard to versioning, and after that, it's beyond our ability to have time.
Right, and there's also I can see the author wanting to continually tinker, as we all do. You write something and you go back to it 3 months later and go, I could have said that so much better. So I think one of the ways that we did address that in the core portion of the contract was defining what is a new version. And we did that. The suggested amount is 30%, but it's also one of those things that, it's in brackets, so you can pick your percent, if you will, and also really said that a new version would be substantive changes. So that's hopefully something that will help prompt a discussion with the author and set the expectation early that, if 3 months afterwards you'd like to tinker, we really don't have the capability to do that. But if there are substantive changes in the field, or if in the case of like the archaeological project, it may be that in a year or two something very new is discovered about that project, and it might be worth having a new version of the Gabby E project at that point.
So I got the mic, but you answered my question already, which was about when is it a derivative and when is it a really new thing. So that's great.
Yeah, I think so. Just to be completely upfront, the proof is going to be in the pudding, as they say. So we're offering this as a model publishing contract, not because we think it's ideal, but because we think it's a place to start. And so really I can see this evolving over time, particularly as presses are using it for these long-form scholarship projects. I think that's at the point where we'll begin to discover what its strengths are and what its weaknesses are. And because it is a contract, it can be changed and it can be modified. So it's certainly not a clay tablet.
This is actually not something, and I'm Steve Cohen from Duke University Press. This is not something that is missing here, but just something I wanted to point out, which is you're talking about Creative Commons licenses and also talking about permissions for content that is coming from a third party. And if you actually dig down into the current version of the Creative Commons license, the legal language there, it says very clearly people may use this in whole or in part.
Yes.
And that is something to be very careful about, because the part they may want to use might actually belong to someone else that the publisher does not have the right then to pass on to someone else.
Yeah.
It's something I've become aware of because we have a bunch of content at Knowledge Unlatched or in Authy Trust where we've put Creative Commons licenses on, and I'm now realizing that we've said people can use it in whole or in part, and the part might be a chapter in a book that was actually in a journal and it doesn't really belong to us to hand on to others, and something I'm trying to work with Creative Commons, but it's just something to watch out for there.
Yeah, so I think that's a great suggestion, and it's also a continuing challenge. One of my soapboxes is that we often don't appropriately attribute like images at times. I mean, we're pretty good about Creative Commons. We're not always good about actually saying we reprinted this with permission and for whom. I think that's not necessarily true in presses, but I do think it can be true in things that are digital. So, we get used to the norms that are like blogs, et cetera, where we're not necessarily as formalistic as we perhaps should be. And so I think you're correct, that is very much a challenge. So maybe that's something we can kind of look at doing a supplementary document, really kind of calling that out as a potential area just to be aware of with these projects. That maybe that's something that could be given to authors so that they understand this better, because they're confused.
I think the role of the parent institution of the author has been one that we've been wrestling with, and I think it's particularly interesting in the case of the previous presentation where Liz from Brown and Sarah from UConn and Maria Bonn from University of Illinois were talking about the role of the library and collaborations in developing parts of the project, and where, what part of this contracting process those entities might be involved in. I mean, Liz, do you have anything? I know you're really early in the process, but...
I mean, first of all, I would love to have access to all of these things that you guys are working on, because I am, we are getting to a point where I am seeking permissions for images and different things, because we are planning, and I'm from Brown, because we are planning to partner with a university press. It's hard. I think there are going to be two different phases of contracting, and I'm trying to conceive of a way to write permissions contracts that allow me to only do that once. Although I know even, and one thing I was going to bring up, I was working before I went to Brown on digital publications in a museum context, and so we were working a lot with images and being very conscientious about rights holders, or working with contemporary art as well, so a lot of living artists. Another thing that came up for us is a lot of rights holders and organizations aren't ready for in perpetuity.
Yeah.
So we have, in many, many cases, 5-year permission. And at some point, someone's going to have to renew that. It's also a budgetary concern if you're planning for preservation. Paying for rights for contemporary artists is, significant expense for things like that. I'm very eager to see all of these documents when you all are through with them.
So just to follow up on that, because I think you're absolutely correct, and some of those challenges, no document will completely be able to overcome. But everything that we're doing will be publicly available, and it will also be issued with a CC0 license, because we want it to be adopted and reused. So, and we realized that while our focus was really on kind of long-form scholarship for university presses and academic publishers, that there are others, such as digital scholarship centers, that could use these kinds of documents as well. perhaps with some modifications in some cases, so.
And I think another important part of this is our expectation is that various different clauses in here might be useful. So just the idea that you might want to introduce a clause about preservation, or you might want to introduce a clause about versioning into your existing contracts. And just to the point about digital scholarship centers as well, I mean, as a library publisher as well, I mean, the benefits of introducing a memorandum of understanding with our authors, even if it's quite an informal sort of piece of work, have been substantial. And I think that's a lesson learned through the Library Publishing Coalition, because this is all about roles and responsibilities, and getting that clarified really early on has been very, very good. I know that Duke and Cornell libraries, that was a roles and responsibilities conversation across different institutions as well. Project Euclid, this is a Project Euclid, yes, example.
And I think we were very careful, I'm sorry. Yep. Yeah, so this is a joint venture between Duke University Press and the Cornell University Library. And so to set that up, we were very careful to say just which of us was responsible for which things. And then we were actually working with Raym Crow at Spark to help us nail this down. And he said, God, I wish all these intra-university arrangements that happen between a press and a library were as careful as you have to be, because it's across institutions, because all these things are generally undefined when it's between a press and a library or various parts of the same university, and that always leads to trouble.
Yes, yes, yes. When your faculty member goes on sabbatical out of the country and doesn't inform you that he's doing that, and the entire project is on hold for 3 months. Not that that's ever happened, but yeah. So I think maybe for those who are librarians in the room, we've talked a little bit about subventions, and I'm wondering if there are folks who have open access publishing funds, and if you do, have you considered kind of the open access publishing fund as being something that could be applied to books, even though they're more often really applied to journal articles?
I'm about to pick on Yuan here.
Oh, that's a surprise. But anyway, at Princeton, we haven't had an OA funding, but that's something we wanted to work on at next stage. But I think, if it can pay journal publications, I don't see the reason it cannot pay for books. I mean, it's probably varies by amount, but I just, don't have a rationale to not paying it.
So I think, are there other thoughts on that?
Questions, comments?
Because I think that makes a good segue to what Nancy and Kim are going to talk about, because one of the challenges is we don't exactly know how much a journal article costs, so that we have some sense of range based on the typical APCs that are charged. But for monographs, particularly when you start talking about digital long-form scholarship, there's a whole set of questions to ask, and I think that's really where the work of Nancy and Kim has been so essential.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, everyone, for coming and sharing your lunch hour or more with us. One of the really interesting aspects of these questions for us dates back to 2014, which seems like a short lifetime ago. And it was at that point that Ithaca S&R was awarded a Mellon Foundation grant to look at the actual costs of publishing a monograph. So we're looking now back to the territory that Lisa was describing, where open access distribution and institutional subvention might intersect. And while there was a lot of information out there about the cost of publishing journal articles, as Lisa said, there was really a dearth of information about what it actually costs to publish a manuscript, or a monograph, pardon me. So the parameters of this grant were to look at all of the costs involved in publishing a digital humanities monograph up to the point of first digital copy. So stripping away all of the printing and post-publication marketing type activities, just those costs up to first digital copy. And the project was structured as a study of 20 university presses, looking at 20 published titles for each press. And it consisted of on-site visits to gather staff-level data. And this data was gathered at all stages of the publishing process, and it included the direct costs that we all typically think of in a profit and loss format when we're evaluating titles for publication. It looked at overheads that are typically kept track of in the back office, and it looked at the staff time involved at every point at which a person touched the monograph. So what we found out when Nancy and I were on the ground, sitting in people's offices and having conversations and doing the data gathering, is we found that presses really liked the guidance for understanding what the range of costs in publishing a monograph were. And they really enjoyed seeing the mechanism that was available to see the actual costs of staff time and the value added that the staff brought to each part of the process. And that having that, the costs of that staff time broken out by department and activity was really valuable. We also found that the staff level discussions about the processes and the obstacles and that perceived value added were really useful at all levels of the organization, from the people actually doing the work to the upper levels of management. So some really great discussions came out of those, and all of that proved especially valuable for the presses. The other thing that we found was that there was a desire for other publishers who weren't engaged in that initial study to have access to some of the ideas and methodology that were generated by this study. So a second round of grant funding was requested to come up with a new costing tool. So this is something that was partnered with the AUP and supported by another Mellon grant to look at those aspects of the initial monograph costing project, keep the things that were valuable, but put together a simpler and more scalable methodology around them that could be used by any publisher and that would have potentially utility beyond looking at just a first digital copy of an open access monograph. So as I say, this was a Mellon-funded grant. It was actually published yesterday. It went live on the web yesterday, this actual tool, and we'll give you a URL at the end on a final slide. So after all of these processes were put into place and were simplified and were appropriately scaled so that people could actually use these without a lot of guidance from having two researchers sitting in their offices for a few days, a few very long days, what we were able to come up with for users of this tool were two final outputs. The first is a dashboard that shows all of the data for the projects that one might study with this methodology, with this tool, and it captures that data at staff, the department, and the press levels. It shows a snapshot of average costs, and it gives some visualizations of key measures that are really useful. The other thing that we have is a cost statement, which is essentially a P&L statement without the revenue side. And we'll get to some of the issues about the revenue sides shortly. But all of these tools potentially have the value if someone is thinking about asking for institutional subvention. These tools are really valuable for helping to peel away the different layers of costs, to better understand them and to better possibly explain them to someone who might be thinking about providing an institutional subsidy. That said, the exercise, while successful, was not without challenges, and Nancy gets the unenviable task of describing what those challenges are.
Thanks, Kim. So I'll just, and I knew this was going to happen. This podium will not work for some of us. Hi, guys.
Podium challenge.
I know I might stroll around with the microphone too, but I'm assuming folks can hear. Can I hold this? Yeah. So you have a fighting chance to actually see me. I just want to step back and also say, we're talking about documents, right? Even the shortest, cutest form of a new contract is a contract. Not exactly the most exciting thing in the world. A very complicated Excel spreadsheet. Also, you see all the tabs along the bottom, right? This is not exactly like beach reading for anybody. But I actually think that it's pretty exciting in that it's been a while since folks have said, let's actually take these instruments that we've been using for a very, very long time and completely rethink what they should look like. And unless I'm missing something, that hasn't happened for a long time. And the process by which we say, we've been cobbling together the little incremental changes and how we'd have to adjust a contract or how we'd have to tweak a P&L to really say what would a new one look like, that actually is pretty new. So I hope you'll have a chance to really dig in and look at this stuff. So that said, our little project, I'm going to keep looking over here, it was a little bit tricky on the cost modeling side because we were actually asking a question of a very specific audience. So we went right to university presses, so folks who have a traditional way of publishing scholarly monographs in print and somewhat in digital as well. And we were asking them essentially to imagine a future world where you would be doing this digital first open access. We weren't capturing something that had necessarily been done. We were using historic data to try to invent something that hadn't been done yet. So, that's the big caveat, is that we used the data we had, but we're all trying to imagine in the future, how is this going to play out? If there were to be an open access model whereby some fairy godparent or the Mellon Foundation or your university decided to make it possible to have an author-side subsidy, what would you say you needed? What would you ask for if you're the press? So that's where ours came from. We did not have historical data on digital first open access. We had historical data on regular books. And what we did is we just asked a series of questions that was intended to kind of peel back some of the elements we thought you might not need anymore. We asked people to leave the printing costs to the side, leave the sales costs to the side. And so what we were left with was this nugget of other costs that ended up being the real headline of our study. And for those of you who haven't seen it, I encourage you to take a look. I know some of you I look guiltily at because I know that you've worked through this with us over a great deal of time, but the costs are still high. The costs are still fairly high, and so as these next generations of questions come, there are going to be additional questions about why they're high and do they need to be high. So there's another piece of this that comes into play too, which you would love to have more historical data to base this on, but what's going to happen going forward for a university press when we're talking about, in the past, what used to literally be a business document, a profit and loss statement, estimating, is it worth taking on this project? What is it going to cost me to make it, and what do I hope to gain from selling it? If the selling piece is kept off to the side. So let's assume that there might be a ton of questions. If you have an open access book, what are other ways of generating revenue from that intellectual content aside from selling that object that we just told you had to make openly available? So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence and there's some experimentation going on, but that's a big open question for what that will ultimately look like. When we expand the question to things like Gabby E that Charles is talking about, these really dynamic, multivalent projects where there's a database here and there's book content there and there's scholarly, new scholarly material interwoven throughout, what will that look like? What pieces will presses end up selling? What pieces will presses end up leaving open? These hybrid models, they certainly exist. There are some examples already, but for presses getting into this space, that's very different. And this may be a good moment also to point to kind of our stance here, which is interesting because among folks who are very deeply immersed in digital humanities, you may have pretty good tools for understanding what it costs to, for example, digitize something or to execute a plan. And it often does not even include the discussion of revenue. What's so interesting about this, to me anyway, is that this is really coming from the publisher side, where the revenue piece, at very least cost recovery, if not better, is kind of baked into the DNA. So it puts an interesting set of constraints and opportunities around the digital humanities question, which in the past has often just been, let's spend that grant down and do it great. So let's say there is revenue. What happens to the revenue on some of these open projects or digital projects? In the past, all the risk was the publishers, so all the rewards were the publishers. What's going to happen in the future if some of that subsidy has come from a third party? Are they going to expect a thank you if you find revenue from an additional source? I'm not going to weigh in on the questions. I'd love to hear from the crowd whether or not you think they ought to. But there are interesting models that I suspect will shake out about, can we keep open access and the subsidy off to the side over here? And if we do some risk-taking over there, again, maybe that goes back to looking like a traditional question of, if we invest here in something enhanced, we get to benefit. So whether or not that happens, I think that remains to be seen. Firmly in the question of, I think, an open question. So is this our big open slide, Charles?
Yes.
All right.
So this is, on the financial side, in digital scholarship, what else changes in digital open access scholarship? I'm sort of approaching Krista here. I'm coming along. Is that unfair?
I'm glad you're warning me.
Any other thoughts about, on the financial side, things that might change in digital scholarship or open access?
I'll say one of the things I continually think about with, the open access or with different ways of permissioning, like the like Media Commons things, is all of the work that gets put into making content and scholarship open. And if it is freely available for use, for anyone to come in and reuse, I have this lingering anxiety that a large for-profit corporation will come in, will throw money into a system that will scrape together data that they will sell very expensively, and that institutions that are not earning any money won't have the resources to create their own open version of it. And so the open content will just feed into a for-profit system. And I don't know how to differentiate, or account for that in my sort of far future thinking. That's just a general anxiety. I don't know how likely that is, but
I bet you read a lot of dystopian novels.
I avoid them for that reason.
Yeah. No, but I would wonder for the publishers here what your take on that is. How open does open need to be so that you're also protecting the thing you have built?
Pascal.
Excellent.
Well, I would just ask a question. Do we come back to Creative Commons then and say no derivatives, no commercial use?
I mean, how do you feel about that, Lisa? I mean, is that antithetical to the idea?
So I'm putting on my Lisa hat, so I'm speaking only for myself at this point. So one of the things within the model publishing contract is that the author keeps their copyright, and they're giving a non-exclusive license for kind of non-commercial uses and more of an exclusive license to the publisher for commercial uses. And one of the Creative Commons licenses that we have is a non-derivative, and CC by ND/NC. And so for me personally, I think there does need to be consideration given there. And the Creative Commons licenses are optional, including, do you offer them at all? And if so, which ones? So the publisher can pre-select the Creative Commons licenses that are available, on the contract form. For me, if we say to the author, you have the rights in this thing, we're respecting that you are the creator, I think we also have to respect that they get some choice in the matter. And so I personally don't ascribe to it's not open enough if it's not CC by. I think that works in some contexts, but I think book publishing is different. There's a whole set of sub-licensing that may happen that doesn't happen in the journal article realm, for example. So I think we need to tread forward in a way that we consider options. And we consider, the work and how it's distributed and, what the funding model is, because we're really looking at both a different business model and a different distribution model. And we're going to have to balance those two things and probably work by work, knowing what that particular project is, knowing what the goals are, et cetera. So I will also say that we have an open access humanities journal that's sponsored at Emory called Southern Spaces. It's existed for 10 years. And the editorial board, which is primarily graduate students, approached me a couple years ago, and they wanted to offer Creative Commons licenses. And we took this same approach because we're dealing with primarily humanists who are not as comfortable or familiar with Creative Commons licenses, and we're also dealing with authors who are not in the academy. So, they have less familiarity. And so we did this approach of, select either, one of these 4 Creative Commons licenses or none at all. And that has worked in that environment because of that ability to kind of pick and choose rather than prescribing this is what you must do. So that was part of what informed our approach here.
So thinking or speaking as a publisher, I think it depends on whether the subvention is sufficient to really cover all of those costs, however we have defined them. If we think it's really sufficient and we've gotten it all in a lump and that's all we ever need, then making it open and anybody can do anything with it is just great. If we're thinking of that subvention as helping to cover the costs and we're thinking of this as a hybrid project, then we're going to want to restrict pretty carefully what other people can do because we have some hopes of creating an enhanced electronic version that's going to make us some money, or creating print versions that are going to make us some money, or licensing out in some way. And so I think it really depends whether, and that's where the costing analysis really helps us say, okay, is this covering everything we need or not? And having a tool for that, and so that we could be comfortable that that's true and not a wild guess on our part, would be very useful.
And going back to what Nancy said, being able to model those revenues is really, we're just looking at blank space right now. We really don't know what those revenues look like, but being able to determine what they might look like, especially in the context of sub-rights income, becomes more and more important. Thinking about it in that manner.
I'd like to pick on Robert here. I'm sorry, Robert. But thinking about one of the major areas of costs that we don't know what to do with is the question of platform costs, and especially the question of preservation costs, how to price preservation into this. And you have been thinking about this.
Well, I've definitely been thinking about it, but I don't have any answers, not for those two. But I think that's something that has to be looked at in terms of not only the preservation of the content for the scholar, but the preservation of the content for the next iteration of it, whether it's the iteration to keep it preserved or the iteration to keep it in that next revenue stream that you were talking about. And I think one of the key things here is in looking at how this runs, like when we look at these new model kind of platforms, they have to be tied enough to community platforms in order for them to survive, or else you're going to get these one-off silos. And I can tell you the 10 or 12 of those we have from IU that have happened over time, and they were experiments, and they did good things when they were built. But at this point, one of the ones we have, we really want to get the content moved from the old platform to our newer Hydra Fedora platform, Avalon. And the main reason being is we want a shot at preserving it and keeping the scholarship alive. And the cost for that's going to be pretty deep. We're hoping that one of those clear Latin American fellowships comes through, because that's what the content's about. But that's only going to be part of the response. So I think it's complex, but I think there are enough people in the community that would love to talk about what you see. Like if you want to do a first run of some baseline funding for preservation and some baseline funding on platform, and ask yourself this: if you're getting into this model of supporting this new kind of publication that doesn't have a print, real version of it to ensure your preservation piece, then how much are you willing to put and balance from the revenue stream and the investment stream into the platform and the preservation angle? That's the real question you have to ask. How much are you willing to put?
Well, and all of a sudden, what we just saved by not having a warehouse is going to start to look like it's just shown up in your platform and your preservation costs.
So where did that go, right?
Right.
So if it's not going back into investment for your longer term strategy for this, it shouldn't just be this thing that's getting absorbed somewhere and you don't understand where it's getting absorbed, right?
Right. So one of the things that Kim and I worked on a bit was trying to figure out, I think some of these costs get bundled, rolled up into, in our report, what looks like overhead. And so I would be the first to admit, our approach, we did a lot of gathering, but it probably in the published report looks like IT costs. Sorry.
I love that line.
Yeah. And right, there's a lot that lived under there before it got into the published report. But that's really interesting, and that almost merits its own, its own budgeting, its own breakdown, and you might even want it kind of as top line items if you were saying why something is going to cost, not $7,500 per book, but it might be that you have that technology support fee that's almost its own item that shows up that includes some other things, platform costs, developer costs.
I think this also illustrates, this is also illustrating just that it's very important to be thinking across sectors here, because within the library technology community, thinking about data repositories, thinking about all of these projects, a lot of this work has already been done, at least raising the questions, not finding the answers. And so it's interesting, that's why it's interesting to talk at a conference like this, rather than just a publishing conference, cross-sector. Nancy, do you want to keep going?
I thought I just referenced, thanks. I thought I just referenced a couple of these. I might take it backwards, actually. Sorry, I'm taking my slides in reverse sequence. But to be more relevant here, and Charles actually helped to kind of flesh out some of these. So, Robert, to your point, we thought like an initial shot at this was there's something around storage and, in the way that might change if we're not just talking about a PDF file, but like who knows how many images and other kinds of multimedia there might be. The programmer developer time has to be in there. Maybe that sits next to what we have called acquisitions and editorial development time. That's the creative time on the building. The presentation platform costs, and just my reminder is that it's the building piece, it's the maintaining piece, and the upgrading piece. Charles, you had mentioned the transcription costs, because we haven't really talked about accessibility, but that certainly will become it's a current generation issue, but something that will have to be budgeted forward as well. And then metadata enrichment, pointing to whatever the new discovery strategies will be. So these are all, and I know Susan actually is working a lot on this piece too. So these are all, they're not entirely new, but the scale in terms of how critical they will be for these, not just digital books, but digital projects, is significant. This is just a reminder also to myself and to all of us, I guess, that in some cases, it's not just that we have to find them, but there may not actually be costs that we know yet. So we still have a category of things that are like placeholders. So something like the platform cost, is it your platform, is it their platform? Are they charging you? Are you building something? Again, that probably depends, again, on the scale of whether it's one little book that sits with an aggregation or whether it sits with your library. The distributor costs for open access books, there was an interesting session the other day on the supply chain and talking about, like, literally, if a book is open, doesn't carry a price, wouldn't it be a shame to not have it through all those great retail channels, which is the way that people find out about new works? So that's an active discussion that's going on right now and extremely important to resolve. The aggregator sites is a little farther along. Sometimes it's a per book cost. It sounds like that's emerging, but I think that's emerging as of this year. I don't think those numbers have been around for terribly long. And then other things like usage analytics, marketing fees. Again, there were always lines in a budget for marketing. It just may be that you're paying new vendors, new prices to do a different kind of marketing that has to get done for discovery. And then I just kind of, even to one step farther out, back away from just the technology side, but also just that some practices around things that are digital, and in particular things that might not carry a price. I think there are some super interesting questions about what this means for for how we think about what these digital publications are and how we'll measure whether or not they're successful. So the first thing is metrics. And again, I think there are a couple sessions at this conference this week about how you will figure out if the thing you've built is a success. So if we're not going to talk about annual sales revenue, what is our impact metric of choice? Because at some point you'll want to have some way to gauge if what you're doing is working by whatever definition you choose. An immediate tie-on to that is those wonderful marketing departments that do so much work today at publishing houses. They know the scholars in the field, they know the conferences in the field, they know all the publications in the field. They literally serve as almost like a point-to-point distribution mechanism. They're entirely incentivized, not to be too crass about this, by sales. And that's just the way the structure is. What incentivizes them, and to what extent do they get incentivized and funded if sales is not the object? That will have a lot to do with what the budgets look like. Will we still employ marketing departments doing the same thing? We have actually there's a collection of essays that I've been honored to get to edit, where we have a few people against the grain coming out in the next issue, where people actually talk specifically about some of the marketing and outreach activities and how critical it would be even if money never changed hands as a result. And then there's questions around the long-term play. Is it something that the presses are investing in? Is it something that libraries are investing in? Is it a third-party solution? But, many people more knowledgeable than I have taken this on and are still taking this question on, but we know that it's a huge deal, and it certainly will have implications for funding as well. So that takes me to the end of this. I guess the takeaway here was just that there are a ton of ripe questions, and I would love to hear from folks about what questions you feel are really the most pressing ones as we go from something that was a cute little book sitting on a shelf to a digital thing out in the world to an open thing to a sprawling digital project.
Go to the last slide. So just getting the URL up there for the various different projects. One thing that I think has been really interesting to us is with the open access work especially, it really has started to reveal the very crucial role that third parties, so aggregators, vendors of various sorts, play in the information supply chain. And it's also started to provoke conversations about real costs of the activities that they are, the value that they're adding, which haven't been conversations that libraries and publishers have been used to having up to then. And I think Pascal's going to see me approaching him to see if he has any thoughts about that, sort of looking from a kind of intermediary angle at this landscape. And how do the information supply chain partners remain viable in this kind of landscape?
So the things I think about are the interest of library vendors who provide kind of mega aggregate, Primo and Summon, et cetera. They're going to be interested in starting to index OER content and probably OA monographs and things like that. And, from the library point of view, they've already contacted us about harvesting ETDs. And that's been a fairly simple process. So it perhaps, depending on the platform, that could be fairly easy as well. I'm kind of outside of this area, so I can't really speak too much on it, but that's what I see from my perspective in the library.
It's a lot about sort of reducing some of the friction by making it easy from a publisher end. Any other questions or comments from the group? Yes.
Hi, I'm Adam from Sage. Just a quick thought. We're going through migrations aplenty over the last couple of years. We're migrating our journals platform in the next few days, and we've moved ebook platforms quite recently as well. And what we've come to learn is that all of these platforms that we have a shelf life. And I wonder whether you're building into your thinking the necessity at some point in the future to return to some kind of CapEx expenditure and just go, okay, well, we've got to start afresh. Sorry.
I wonder, Robert, are you thinking about that?
I was just going to say that goes back to having more detail on that line item to really bring that out, because it's not about upgrading at some point. At some point, it's really about thinking of migration. And like you said, you start from scratch because at some point the technology runs out on you and you have to start over. But it's for me, it's always knowing about how I'm going to get the data back out to start with, knowing that it's going to the next however many platforms. And that's the real big issue, though, because as you go to build the new technology stack, sometimes it becomes unaffordable for you in the role you're in. So either it needs to come from someone who's pulled something together across things on the outside, or you need to figure out, what role your content's playing anymore, right? And you don't need a full stack thing anymore. You need something that's just providing the pieces that people are interested in now, right? But that's the kind of thing that you don't see coming all the time, and sometimes you can run yourself into a wall, and you built the next great thing to run your stuff in, and then, it's passed you by. It took you too long, or you didn't get out the door fast enough, or something like that.
So I think that definitely that's a part of the model on the expense side, and it has to be. The difficulty is estimating what it will be and how far out those costs will occur when they do occur. And I think it's pretty obvious that they will be there. The question is when and how much. So and I don't know if what you're suggesting is putting together some sort of almost a reserve fund to take that into account, or...
I think it's considering attrition as being possible.
Mm-hmm. Right, and trying to put a dollar figure on that is really a huge challenge. Yeah.
Trying to tell a thunder about that.
Right.
Yes, it's like paying for electricity. It's fine when it's for personal use. When it runs a supercomputer, somebody has to pick up the bill, right?
I mean, a question for Nancy and Kim. So there are lots and lots of questions here and lots of uncertainties. Do you plan to actually develop out this part of the model? Because you've kind of got to the fairly flat open access cost, as it were, the first digital cost. But are you thinking of doing more work on the question of these rather more complex digital objects, bringing in library expertise and aggregator expertise?
Well, we're hoping to. We have, Nancy and I talk frequently, and we have realized as we talk that being able to define some of this landscape better will help us develop the tools that are actually effective in dealing with them. And there are still some things that really are pretty ill-defined, and the thing that we keep coming up against is the revenue side, and what revenue looks like in this kind of digital context. And we think that there's just a lot there that needs to be discussed. The stakeholders are changing. They've changed and continue to change as some of these projects take shape. And for a given project, I think, Lisa, we were talking about this earlier, for a given project, things could be completely different. There could be a completely different set of stakeholders for project A than digital project A and digital project B. So I think some of it is identifying the commonalities and trying to determine how to quantify them. But some of these definitions, I think, need to be worked through.
I was also going to say that our starting point here was it was very specific to university presses publishing books. And so that's a real constraint. And, I think it's still an interesting tool that you can work with. It's extremely valuable for having exhaustively listed out the categories that you'll want to consider. But I think a terrific shift on this might be having it having a closer look from a library context. And in the same way that we worked with publishers to say, well, I know that huge amount of work you do that we're now calling overhead is for your whole press. What slice of it is it fair to charge against just the books we're talking about? I wonder if there's a comparable exercise that libraries are engaging in. So we know that the universities have an overhead number, but as a unit called the library that does a discrete set of activities, if you know, how easy would it be to literally carve out that set of activities around the digital initiatives you're supporting, and maybe that becomes your kind of archive fee that sits alongside the direct costs that are the easy ones to find, relatively easy. So that's the next piece, is kind of shifting the lens to make it more directly useful to something that's a born digital, not book.
And not necessarily generated by a traditional publisher.
But also maybe generated by a traditional publisher. I think one of Adam's comment was so interesting, because this is the conference where we see so many interesting digital projects created by commercial publishers like Alexander Street Press, like Sage, etc. And when it comes to the revenue side, many of them have been doing this sort of thing for a while and having to work out how the systems work. Just coming back to GABI-E. GABI-E is not an open access project. The GABI publication has open data, but the 3D visualization and the text part we'll actually charge for. And that's actually because the authors are forcing us to. The authors strongly believe that without a price point, their work will not be discoverable, and also they want a certain amount of income to come back to this project in order for them to publish new volumes in the series. So this is, again, digital scholarship versus open access, but very interesting questions. Okay, this has been a fabulous discussion. Thank you so much. Thanks to this panel, thanks to all of you, and onwards and upwards.